She was hired to sit with the Duke's simple nephew. He was the Duke himself. You may as well know it now, because he knew it the whole time, and it seems unkind that you should be the only ones in the dark besides her. Miss Tamsin Veale would spend 11 weeks in that house, without the smallest suspicion. You will spend this hour knowing everything she does not. I trust you to enjoy the difference, and to stay for the moment she catches up, because when she does, she will do it in front of a magistrate, a paid physician, and the one man in England who most needed her to fail. It began, as these things so often do, with a sentence she was never meant to hear. Tamsin was 34, the unmarried niece of a Harrow Cross stationer, and for 12 years she had kept her uncle's ledgers, minded her uncle's shop, and taken up so little room in her uncle's house that the family had half forgotten she was in it. The floorboards above the shop were old and confiding, and one evening in late October, they carried her aunt's voice down through the ceiling as clearly as if Mrs. Dunnage had spoken into her ear. "Send Tamsin. Nobody will miss her, and nobody is waiting to marry her. She may as well be useful." Tamsin stood at the counter with a column of figures half added under her hand, and she did not make a sound. She had a great deal of practice at not making a sound. She finished the column. She got it right too, which she was quietly proud of afterwards, because her eyes were not entirely dry while she did it. The engagement her aunt was so eager to hand away had arrived that morning by the Northern post, a companion wanted at Felgate Hall, at the far cold edge of Harrowmere, where the county runs out of hedgerows and takes up stone instead. A quiet, sensible, unattached person was required to sit with a gentleman described only as Mr. Edmund, nephew to His Grace the Duke of Renfield. The gentleman did not speak. The gentleman was not to be troubled with questions. The term was 11 weeks, through the worst of the winter, at 1 shilling and 6 the day, the whole sum payable at the end of the term, and not a day before. The advertisement, I should say, was not even a lie. It was merely the truth, one funeral out of date. Tamsin read it twice, put on her bonnet, and answered it herself before her aunt could do it for her. If she was to be sent away for being nobody, she would at least do her own sending. And here I must take you north for a moment, because on the very evening her letter of application reached Felgate Hall, it was read, in a study kept locked, because it is kept locked, by candlelight, twice, by a silent man in a plain brown coat. There were 11 applications in that post, 10 of them flattered. One of them, in a round, honest shopkeeper's hand, with a single unapologetic inkblot, named its terms plainly, promised nothing but punctuality and patience, and flattered nobody at all. The silent man read that one a third time. Then he set it on top of the pile, and the matter was decided. You know why he could afford to be particular about honesty. She never once thought to ask. Remember that it was he who chose her. It will matter, at the end, in front of a magistrate. She had no idea she was walking into a trap. In fairness, neither did the man who built it. She went north on the 2nd of November, changing coaches at the Hart and Hollow, where the landlady looked at her direction, said Felgate, and then said nothing else at all, which in a coaching inn is a kind of eloquence. The last stage was a carrier's cart, and the last mile was walked, uphill, into a wind with opinions. Felgate Hall stood grey against a greyer sky, a long, stern old house with its shoulders up, half its windows shuttered, and smoke rising from exactly one chimney, as if the house were rationing its own warmth. Harrowmere people, she would learn, called it the Duke's cold pocket, and had called it that for 100 years. Mrs. Pursglove, the housekeeper, received her at a side door, a small, upright woman with keys enough at her waist to lock up a cathedral, and a face that had been arranged, long ago, into permanent discretion. "You'll be the companion," said Mrs. Pursglove. "I'll be the companion," Tamsin agreed. "Then here is the whole of your instruction, and I'll thank you not to make me repeat it. Mr. Edmund does not speak. Do not take it hard, and do not take it as an invitation to speak twice as much yourself. The last one did, and she lasted 9 days. You will sit with him from 10 until dusk. You will not ask him questions about the family. You will not press him, and you will not go into the east study, which is kept locked, because it is kept locked. His Grace the Duke is abroad, and has left the arrangement of the household to Mr. Gastrell, whom you will meet soon enough. Here, Mrs. Pursglove paused, in the way people pause when they are deciding how much truth a stranger has earned. Take the wage at the end of the term, and go home warm. That is the best that can be done at Felgate, and I have been doing my best here for 30 years. The terms of the thing had teeth, and Tamsin felt them straight away. The fee was payable at the end. Leave in week 10, and she left with nothing, and the nothing would reach Harrow Cross before she did, wearing her aunt's "told you so" on its face. There was no walking out of Felgate Hall. There was only the term, and the winter, and whatever sat waiting in the south parlour. What sat waiting in the south parlour was a man of perhaps 36, in a plain brown coat, a farmer would have called modest, seated at a chess table with the pieces set and his hands folded, looking into the fire as if it owed him a letter. "Mr. Edmund," said Mrs. Pursglove, gently, and Tamsin noticed the gentleness, and filed it. "This is Miss Veale, come to sit with you through the winter." He turned his head. "And here I must be careful, because you know what Tamsin did not, and I'll not have you smirking at her." What she saw was this: a tall, quiet, unhurried man, with a still face and dark, attentive eyes, who looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly usual, not rudely, the way a chess player looks at an unfamiliar opening, and then inclined his head, perhaps half an inch, and looked back at the fire. He did not speak. She had been told he would not. What nobody had told her, because nobody at Felgate but the man himself knew it, was that the silent gentleman in the brown coat was Edmund, 6th Duke of Renfield. 8 months into his inheritance, and 11 weeks into the strangest campaign of his life, that the uncle he was supposedly nephew to was in the churchyard, and that the house, the chimney, the locked study, the shuttered windows, and the chair she was about to sit down in all belonged to him. Why a duke should sit in his own freezing hall pretending to be his own poor relation, that, he would have told you, was his business. He had his reasons. They were good ones, and they were his, and they will keep until the proper moment, which is not yet. Tamsin sat down across the chess table, because it was the only other chair drawn near the fire, and regarded the board, and then the man, and then the board again. "I'm told I'm not to trouble you with questions," she said, "so I'll trouble you with a game instead. Fair warning, I learned from my uncle, who cheats. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. It was over before she could name it. She opened with her queen's pawn, and that, though neither the house, nor the county, nor the man across the table would understand it for some weeks, was the first move of the match that would decide who owned Felgate Hall, who wore its coronet, and whether a woman nobody would miss could be missed so badly that a duke would stand up in front of the law of England to say so. The days took a shape, as days in a winter house do. At 10 she came to the south parlour. She read to him. She'd found the library on her 3rd day, a cold room with warm contents, and she read well, in the plain, unperforming way of a woman who reads for the matter and not the applause. Sermons she skipped on her own authority. Voyages he seemed to like. She judged this by the stillness of him, which had varieties, though she could not have said when she had begun cataloguing them. There was the stillness of a man waiting for a page to turn, and the stillness of a man 10 miles away, and, very occasionally, when she editorialized on the text, which she could not always help, a stillness with a suspicious quality of attention in it. At 2 they played chess. This is where I must tell you something to Tamsin's credit, because it is the hinge of the whole story, and she did it in her first week without an audience, which is when character is done. She had begun, those first games, by losing to him kindly. You will know the kind of losing, the moved too fast blunder, the overlooked bishop, charity dressed as carelessness. On the 4th afternoon she took her hand off her rook, looked at the gift she had just wrapped for him, and was ashamed of herself. "No," she said, and set the piece back. "I beg your pardon. That was me letting you win, and I'll not do it again. You'd know, and I'd know, and then there'd be two liars at this table and only one of us getting paid for it. From here on, I play to beat you, Mr. Edmund, and you must bear the consequences." The consequences were as follows. Within a fortnight, she could not beat him at all. It happened by degrees, and each degree was small enough to explain away. A knight, arriving on the one square that undid her plan. Luck, surely. A trap she had laid over 6 patient moves, sidestepped without a flicker. Coincidence. Then came the afternoon. Missus Pursglove called her out to see to a tradesman's bill, and Tamsin returned to find her own bishop moved, 1 square, quietly, from the fork she had left it hanging in, and Mr. Edmund gazing into the fire with the perfect innocence of a cat beside an empty birdcage. "Did you just save me from myself?" she asked. The fire received his full attention. She began, after that, to keep the game book, an old marbled notebook from the library, in which she recorded their games in her round shopkeeper's hand, and scores. The scores were not flattering to her, and she kept them anyway, accurately, because a woman who keeps ledgers for a living does not cook the books merely because the books have started beating her at chess. And she noticed things. She was a noticing woman. Invisible people usually are. It is the one wage invisibility pays. She noticed that his hands were not a farmer's hands. She noticed a Latin phrase penciled in the margin of the Tacitus, in a scholar's hand, correcting the translator. She noticed that when she dropped the inkwell, his arm was there, before her thoughts were. She noticed that simple, at Felgate, was a word used only by people who had never sat across a chessboard from Mr. Edmund, and that the people who had, which was to say herself, and possibly Mrs. Pursglove, used gentler and vaguer words, and looked at the floor while using them. She did not add these things up. Be fair to her. She had been raised her whole life on the arithmetic that said men were what the world labelled them, and women were what the world overlooked, and it is very hard to audit a sum you have been standing inside of since birth. Once, only once that month, the pattern broke. A letter came up from the village with the afternoon bread, sealed in dark wax with a crest Tamsin did not know, and Mrs. Pursglove carried it in to Mr. Edmund herself and stood by while he read it. That afternoon he played the worst chess she ever saw from him, moved without looking, lost a rook to a trick her uncle would have blushed at, and resigned with his eyes on the window and the road. She won, if you can call it winning, and it was the emptiest win of her life, and she entered it in the game book accurately, because she entered everything accurately, with a note beside the score. Does not count. I could tell you what was in that letter. I shan't. The letter will introduce itself in January. But she wrote, at the bottom of the game book, in the small hours of a night, when the wind was working the shutters, "Whatever this house is keeping quiet, it is not a simpleton." She was, of course, entirely right. She then closed the book and apologized to nobody in particular for prying, which was very like her, and is exactly why what happens at the end of this story happens. December came down on Felgate like a lid. The snow shut the roads, the carrier stopped coming, and the world contracted to 1 parlour, 1 fire, 1 chessboard, and 2 people, which is, as regular listeners of mine will have observed, precisely how these things are always arranged, whether by Providence or by a narrator I leave to you. The warmth arrived in small denominations. Her spectacles first. The left hinge had been failing since Michaelmas, mended with thread, and one evening she left them folded by the game book. In the morning the thread was gone, and the hinge was whole, pinned, cleanly, with a sliver of brass cut to fit, work you would pay a Harrow Cross jeweller for and wait a fortnight to get. She turned them under the window for a long moment. "Thank you," she said to the parlour at large. The parlour did not reply. The parlour had, however, gone slightly still, in the manner of a parlour holding its breath. She tried, once that week, to ask, "Mrs. Pursglove, Mr. Gastrell, who manages the household." What manner of man is he? Mrs. Pursglove went on counting linen for the space of 6 pillowcases. The manner that's expected in January, she said at last, and then counted the whole shelf again from the beginning, and Tamsin understood that the subject was closed, locked, and, like the East Study, kept that way because it was kept that way. On Christmas Day itself the house came nearest to giving itself away, and I confess, I held my breath, and I already knew the ending. A rider got through the snow at noon, an estate man from the far side of the county, half frozen, with a letter that could not wait. Tamsin, crossing the hall with the greenery she had bullied out of the frozen garden, heard him ask Mrs. Pursglove, plain as church bells, for his grace, and she heard Mrs. Pursglove answer, in a voice pitched to carry up a staircase, that his grace was abroad, as all the world knew, and the man had best warm himself in the kitchen while she saw what could be done, and then watch the housekeeper carry the letter not to the kitchen, not to the steward's room, but up the stairs and along the passage to the locked East Study, keys already in her hand. Tamsin stood holding her armful of fur and considered the household she was living in. A duke abroad who received his letters by the East Stairs, a locked study that opened for a housekeeper, a simple gentleman with a scholar's hand and a jeweller's fingers. She was, as I have told you, a noticing woman, and the sum was now sitting on the counter in front of her, wanting only to be added. She did not add it. Or rather, and this is nearer the truth, and I'll deal honestly with you even where she didn't quite deal honestly with herself, she declined the addition. Whatever was locked in the East Study, somebody in this house was being protected, and Tamsin Veale had spent her whole life on the unprotected side of doors. She found she could not resent a house for closing ranks around its own. She put the fur along the parlour mantel and said nothing, and that evening lost her 39th game of chess to a man she had privately stopped believing in and personally never trusted more. There is a kind of loyalty that runs ahead of the facts. It is not wise. It is, however, the only kind worth a duke's kneeling for, and I'd ask you to remember this evening when we get there. The Queen came on the first morning of the new year. Her set, his set, as she supposed it, the household's set, was missing its white queen, deputized these many years by a thimble. Sitting down to the year's first game, she found the thimble retired, and in its place, a new carved queen of pale wood, crowned, straight-backed, unmistakably worked by hand, and, unless the firelight was flattering them both, unmistakably wearing spectacles. Tamsin looked at the Queen. Tamsin looked at Mr. Edmund. Mr. Edmund studied the ceiling with the expression of a man who had never in his life held a knife, a chisel, or an opinion. "She's very fine," said Tamsin, when she could trust her voice. "I hope she plays better than I do." And because the room was warm and the roads were shut, and because he was the first creature in her adult life who had ever listened to her without waiting for his turn to speak, she found herself, over the pieces, telling him things about the shop and the ledgers and 12 years of being the useful one, about the evening in October and the floorboards and the sentence that had sent her north. She told it lightly. She told everything lightly. It was how she carried weight, but she told it all, to the one man in England, though she did not know it, with the power to do something about every word. "Nobody will miss her," she quoted, moving a pawn, "and nobody is waiting to marry her," which was honest at least. "I'd rather be dispatched with the truth than kept with a lie." She looked up and smiled, briskly, to show the matter was closed. "Your move, Mr. Edmund." He did not move. He was looking at her, and this time he did not disguise it, or perhaps for once he could not. The attention she had been cataloguing all winter was turned up to its full and considerable strength, and she felt it land somewhere under her breastbone. Then he reached out and moved his knight and said, in a voice low and unpracticed, rusty at the edges like a gate that has decided, after long deliberation, to open, again, one word, the first she had ever heard from him. She sat very still. Somewhere in the house a clock finished striking before she trusted herself. The game, she said, or the story? His eyes came up to hers and stayed. She reset the board with hands that were not entirely steady, and she did not press him. Mrs. Pursglove had said, "Do not press him," and besides, she found she would rather have earned one true word than begged for 50. But you, who know what she does not, will understand what the word cost, and what it meant, and how much longer the man in the brown coat could reasonably expect to keep the whole truth in check. Not long. The roads were shut, but roads open, and when they opened, they let in Mr. Lucien Gastrell. He arrived in the second week of January, with the Thor, in a hired chaise with a crest painted over, bringing with him a valet, a quantity of luggage disproportionate to any announced length of stay, and 2 guests, a dry, grey gentleman of law named Mr. Craik, and a physician, Dr. Mereweather, whose practice, had anyone inquired, and no one at Felgate was given the chance, consisted largely of signing whatever he was paid to sign. Lucien Gastrell was a cousin on the Renfield side, and he was everything the man in the brown coat was not. Fluent, glossy, delightful within 30 seconds of any introduction, and fundamentally for sale. He kissed Mrs. Pursglove's hand, which she received like a summons. He appraised the hall the way a man appraises what he is about to inherit. And when he was introduced to Miss Veale, the companion, his charm flickered, just once, just measurably, like a candle when a door opens somewhere in the house. "The companion," he repeated. "How good of you, and how does our patient?" This, with a fond glance at Mr. Edmund, who sat at the chess table with his hands folded, watching the fire, gone further away than Tamsin had seen him all winter. "Poor fellow, you mustn't exhaust yourself making conversation at him, Miss Veale. One might as well read novels to the furniture." "The furniture," said Tamsin pleasantly, "has beaten me at chess 41 games running, Mr. Gastrell. I keep the book, if you'd care to check my arithmetic." It was not wise. She knew it was not wise while she was doing it, which by her own private accounting made it worse and by mine makes it better. Lucien's smile reached a new and colder register, and he looked at her, really looked, for the first time, the way a man looks at a loose thread on an otherwise satisfactory garment. "How diverting," he said, "a companion who counts." That evening there was a dinner. Lucien required audiences the way fires require air, and at it he performed the trick that made Tamsin's hands close in her lap. He turned to the silent man at the foot of the table, wine-glass in hand, glittering for the benefit of Craik and Mereweather, and said, "Come, Edmund, give us a word, one word, for our guests. No, sing for us then. He used to make sounds as a boy, you know, before the family gave it up as a bad business. My uncle spent a fortune on physicians. Money," he added, to the physician he had bought, "the estate could ill afford, as we shall see. Well, a chair with a pulse, gentlemen, but the chair will sign, and that is all that's wanted of it." The room laughed, in the way rooms laugh when the man paying for dinner has made a joke. Mr. Edmund looked at the tablecloth, and Tamsin, who had spent 34 years learning to make no sound, and had precisely one evening's practice at unlearning it, set down her fork with a click that fell into the laughter like a stone into a pond. "I have never once heard Mr. Edmund make a sound half so foolish as the ones I've heard this evening," she said. "But then he's careful with his words. I expect that's why he has so many left, and some people run so short." Silence of a fine and ringing quality. Mereweather examined his wine. Craik examined Tamsin over his spectacles, and made, she could see him make it, a note. And at the foot of the table, something else happened, and only 2 people in the room saw it. The silent man's hand came down flat upon the cloth, not loudly, with the terrible deliberateness of a piece being set down at the end of a long calculation. And for one full breath the whole 11-week masquerade stood at the edge of that table with its coat off. Mrs. Pursglove set her cup into its saucer with a rattle you could have heard in the kitchens. The hand withdrew. The fire received his attention once more. And you, who know what nearly happened, may now watch Mr. Lucien Gastrell laugh at a man who had just, by some private arithmetic of patience, decided to let him keep his winnings one more week. Lucien laughed last and alone, lightly, and let it go, which frightened her more than anger would have. Late that night, going up unlit as was her habit, she passed the east study and found its forbidden door ajar on candlelight and voices, and stopped, because the first voice was Crake's, and the second was Lucien's, and the words were these: "Commission of lunacy, then, and Merewether's certificate. Sir Aldous can be brought to Felgate within the week, better here than a public hearing. Once the findings entered, you stand committee of the person and the estate. Of everything, Crake. Say it plainly. We're among friends, and the companion goes tomorrow. She counts. I'll not have counting in this house until the accounts are mine." Tamsin stood in the cold hall with her candle out, listening to two gentlemen arrange to swallow a man whole, and understood three things in quick succession: that the poor fellow at the foot of the table was in the way of something large, that the something large had lawyers, and that she had, by the sum of one mended hinge, one carved queen, one spoken word, and 41 lost games of chess, mislaid her heart in the south parlour of Felgate Hall, which was the one discovery of the winter that had nothing to do with anybody's disguise, and the only one she never thought to question. She did not sleep. At first light she went down to the south parlour, and he was there. Of course he was there, at the board, in the grey dawn, no fire yet, setting out the pieces as if the day could be made ordinary by force. She sat down opposite. She did not reach for a pawn. "They mean you harm," she said quietly. "I'll not dress it up. I heard them in the east study, a commission, a certificate, a magistrate brought here within the week. Mr. Gastrell means to have you declared incompetent and take everything, and I am to be dismissed today because I count." Her voice wanted to shake, and she declined to let it. "So I have one morning left in this house, and I'll spend it saying what I should be sorry to leave unsaid." He had gone very still, the 10 miles away stillness, she thought, except that it wasn't. It was the other one, the listening one, strained to its limit. "They look at you and see furniture," she said. "They have always looked at you and seen furniture. I understand that now. I heard the shape of your whole life in one of Mr. Gastrell's jokes last night. But I have sat across this table from you every day for 10 weeks, and I have never once, not for one afternoon, not for one move, been in the room with a simple man. I've been in the room with the finest mind I ever met, and the kindest, and the most deliberate. And if you are silent, then I'll believe to my last day that the silence is yours for a reason that is also yours, and I'd not take it from you to save my own life." She looked down at the board, at the little wooden queen in her spectacles, and laughed once, unevenly. "My aunt said nobody would miss me. She was wrong by one, sir, and one is enough. I will miss you dreadfully. That's all. That's the whole of my speech. You needn't." Tamsin, her name. In that low, rust-hinged, deliberate voice, her Christian name, which he had never been given, which meant he had gone to the trouble of learning it. "I have spent my life in rooms full of people performing," he said, slowly, laying the words down like pieces. "Performing for what they thought I was, or what they hoped to get, or what they feared. And for 10 weeks I have watched one woman be exactly herself, every day, for a silent nobody in a brown coat who could do nothing for her. You think you came here invisible, Tamsin. You are the only person in this house I have ever actually seen." He turned his hands over, beneath hers, so that they held. "Not simple," he said, "only careful, and never, not once, not for an afternoon, careful with you, because I had to be." She sat with her heart hammering somewhere in her throat. There were 100 questions owed. She asked none of them, and I want you to mark that, because the whole ending turns on it. Given one morning and a speaking man, she did not demand the mystery. She reached across the board and set her hand over his folded ones, and said, "Then be careful a little longer, whatever it is, and win," which is when Mrs. Pursglove came in with red eyes and a folded paper, and the paper was Tamsin's dismissal, signed by Mr. Lucien Gastrell, on behalf of the household, effective before noon, wages forfeit, term unserved. The carrier's cart would take her as far as the Heart and Hollow. 11 weeks, and she would leave with nothing, nothing, and a carved queen, which she took, because some wages cannot be forfeited by any paper signed by any gastrel whatsoever. One duty remained. The game book was the household's, the marbled notebook was library property, and Tamsin Veale had never in her life gone home with so much as a borrowed pencil. The library was shut up for sweeping. Mrs. Pursglove, distracted and grieving, said leave it in the e-study. The doors open for Mr. Crake's boxes, on the desk, quickly, before anyone sees. The e-study, kept locked because it is kept locked. She meant to be 10 seconds. She set the book on the desk, and the desk stopped her where she stood. Letters, a drift of them, opened and docketed in a precise scholar's hand she knew, because she had seen it correcting Tacitus in a margin. Letters addressed, every one, to His Grace, the Duke of Renfield, Felgate Hall, estate papers, signed at the foot, Renfield, in that same hand, a mourning ring. And beneath a paperweight, one letter older and softer than the rest, in a different, failing script, which her eyes had taken in before her conscience could arrive. Edmund, forgive an old man who defended you too late. Trust, Pursglove, trust, no paper Crake brings you. Watch Lucian above all. He has had his hand in the rents for years, and when I am gone he will come for the whole of it, and he will come through you, through the old story, the doctors, the silent year. Let him think you what he always called you. He shows his books to a man he believes cannot read them. It was my uncle's last letter, said the voice from the doorway. He was 3 days writing it. He was dead within 5. She turned. He stood in the doorway of his own study, in the plain brown coat, and he was not Mr. Edmund at all, and the room rearranged itself around that fact with a silence like the moment after glass breaks. You are the Duke, she said. I am the Duke. He came in slowly, and he did not perform it, and he did not plead it. He stood on the far side of his uncle's desk and spent 11 weeks' silence the way he did everything, deliberately, a piece at a time. And she stood among the wreckage of everything she thought she'd known and heard him out, because listening was the country the two of them had always met in. I was 9, he said, a fever. It left a stammer. The stammer left a silence, and the silence left a verdict. My uncle's money paraded me past 20 physicians down the years, 20, Tamsin, each with a new theory, and the same word at the bottom of the bill. Simple, defective, unfit, a breath, measured out like a move considered and made. Lucian was the ornament of the family. I was its apology. And in 100 drawing rooms I learnt the one lesson England teaches better than it teaches Latin. People show their true faces only to those they believe are powerless to remember them. He touched the old letter beneath the paperweight, lightly, the way a man touches a scar. I was abroad when my uncle died. This followed me. You have read it. Trust Pursglove. Trust no paper of Crake's. Watch Lucian above all. I stood at a grave in the rain and did my arithmetic. Come home as the Duke, and every schemer in the county puts on his best face, and I learn nothing until the knife is in. Come home as poor Mr. Edmund, the thing Lucian has called me since we were boys, and the label does my work for me. He shows his true books to a man he believes cannot read them. He dictates his letters in front of furniture. He rehearsed the whole of it, Tamsin, at my own table, over my own wine. His voice did not rise. It had never once risen, all winter. She understood now that this was not affliction but discipline, wound like a mainspring. 8 months. Every false ledger, every letter of Crake's, docketed in this desk. The hearing tomorrow is not his trap closing on me. It is mine, closing on him, a magistrate, witnesses, and every forged paper produced by the forgers themselves, in one room, on the record. It wanted only patience, he said. I have a great deal of patience. And then in November, a woman sat down at my chessboard and told me her uncle cheats and refused to let me win. And for the first time since I was 9 years old, Somebody was honest with me for no reason at all. He stopped. The rust was back in his voice. You gave a silent nobody 11 weeks of your truth, Tamsin, and I paid you for it in disguise the whole while, because I could not risk the one thing I could not bear to lose. I am asking you, don't, she said. The word came out cracked. All winter she had declined to let her voice shake. It shook now, and she let it, because there are mornings when the ledger must be read aloud entire. You let me tell you about the floorboards, she said. About my aunt. About 12 years of being the useful nobody. I laid every plain thing I own on that chess table, sir, in front of a duke who was studying which of his neighbours could be trusted, and I will need. She pressed the back of her wrist to her mouth, hard, and finished it. I will need to be somewhere else while I learn whether I was your friend or your evidence. And because she was Tamsin Veale, she then straightened her spine, wished his grace a fair hearing and a long life, took up her small trunk with the carved queen wrapped in a stocking at the heart of it, and walked out of Felgate Hall through the front door, which was, Mrs. Pursglove said later, the only time in 30 years she ever saw anybody use it properly. The carrier set her down at the Heart and Hollow at dusk. She took the cheap room, sat on the narrow bed, and did not cry, or at any rate, that is her account. And the landlady's differs, and I was not there. And at Felgate, the Duke of Renfield stood at a window watching the road, in possession of 8 months of proof, a hearing set for the morrow, the certain ruin of his enemy, and the growing, corrosive knowledge that he had run the finest campaign of misdirection in the county's memory and lost the only engagement that mattered. He had wanted to know how the world treats a man who cannot buy its manners. He had his answer. She was a mile down the Harrow Cross road, and she had paid for his answer with everything she had. Patience, for the first time in his life, failed to console him. Sir Aldous Fern, magistrate, arrived at 11 the next morning, stamping snow, to conduct what Mr. Craik's letters called a discreet inquiry into the capacity of the gentleman resident at Felgate. The great hall was arranged like a small court, the magistrate's table, chairs for Dr. Mereweather and Mr. Craik, the household to witness, and, fetched from the Heart and Hollow by a summons Lucian himself had sworn out, one Miss Veale, lately companion, required to give evidence of the gentleman's condition. Lucian had reasoned, correctly, that a dismissed servant with forfeited wages makes a biddable witness. He had reasoned incorrectly about everything else in the room. Mereweather went first, and was fluent, congenital simplicity, mutism of long standing, incapable of managing person or property. He had prepared his certificate. Craik followed with the estate's disarray. Ledgers were produced and laid before the magistrate, showing 8 months of confusion since the late Duke's death. It was all going beautifully. Lucian sat with the modest sorrow of a man being handed a dukedom for its own good. Then Sir Aldous called the companion. You sat with the gentleman daily, Miss Veale. In 11 weeks, did he ever speak? She looked across the hall at the man in the brown coat, seated apart, hands folded, watching her with the whole of that considerable attention. A biddable witness, with every reason to be bitter, and her wages in Lucian's pocket. Twice, sir, said Tamsin. Once to ask for another game of chess. Once to say my name, and I'd trouble the court to notice he pronounced it correctly, which is more than my own family manages. A ripple, Sir Aldous' mouth twitched. But you're asking the wrong sum, sir, if I may. I keep books for a living. You've been shown a column of what the gentleman doesn't say. Add up what he does. He mended my spectacles with a jeweller's pin. He carved a chess queen truer than any in a Harrow Cross shop window. He has beaten me at chess 41 games running, and I am not, your worship, easy to beat. If that man is simple, then I'm a footstool, and you may enter it in the record. The witness is distraught, said Lucian smoothly, rising. She formed an attachment, pitiable, but hardly evidence. The plain fact, Sir Aldous, is before your eyes. He cannot answer for himself. Ask him anything. The chair, and he could not resist it. Even there, even then, will sign whatever you put before it. Ask him anything, Sir Aldous repeated slowly, and turned. Sir, do you understand these proceedings? And the man in the brown coat rose. A man who has kept silence for 11 weeks does not waste his first paragraph. He answered the magistrate's Latin courtesy in Latin, and better Latin, observed that Dr. Merewether's certificate was dated 2 days before Dr. Merewether had first laid eyes on him, which the doctor might wish to explain to the college, and then, walking to the magistrate's table, laid beside Crake's ledgers a second set, the true rent rolls, 8 months of them, docketed in a scholar's hand, together with Crake's correspondence and a letter of identification bearing a seal Sir Aldous plainly knew, for he stood up when he saw it, from his Grace the Duke of Ravensmore, who wrote that he had known Edmund, Duke of Renfield, from school, played chess with him at Cambridge, and lost. I am the Duke of Renfield, said Edmund, into a hall you could have heard a pawn drop in. The confusion in my cousin's ledgers is not my incapacity, it is his handwriting. He conducted his whole enterprise in front of me for 8 months, on the understanding that I was furniture. I commend to the court, his own words, spoken in my hall 2 nights ago. A chair, with a pulse. But the chair will sign. He looked at Lucien then, and his voice never once rose, which was the most terrible thing in it. The chair declines. The chair has, moreover, kept minutes. What followed was brief, as demolitions are. Merewether recanted with a speed that verged on athletic. Crake produced, discovered, and surrendered in the space of 10 minutes. Sir Aldous, whose discreet inquiry had transformed under him into the first act of a fraud prosecution, was heard to say that in 40 years on the bench he had never, and then gave it up and simply took depositions. And Lucien Gastrell, ornament of the family, stood in the wreck of his own paperwork, convicted out of his own mouth, and found the whole room looking at him the way rooms had looked at his cousin all his life. Then Edmund turned from the table and looked across the hall at Tamsin, and, before the magistrate, the household, the law of England and its clerks, said, "One matter remains, and it may as well be on the record. I am reliably informed that nobody would miss Miss Veale, and that nobody is waiting to marry her." A breath ran round the hall. Tamsin went white, then scarlet. Both counts are false. I have missed her since yesterday noon to a degree I decline to describe in front of the clerk. And, as to the second, and, here the 6th Duke of Renfield came round the table and knelt, in his plain brown coat, on the stone floor of his own hall, before the woman hired at 1 shilling and 6pence a day to sit with a nobody. Somebody is waiting, Tamsin. He has been waiting all winter. He is, on the advice of every physician in this room, simple enough to hope you'll have him, and careful enough to mean it for the rest of his life. Will you marry me? She looked down at him, and it will tell you everything about Tamsin Veale, that with a dukedom kneeling on cold stone in front of her, her first act was honesty. You still owe me 11 weeks' wages, she said, unsteadily. Marry me, said the Duke, and audit everything I own forever. Well, said Tamsin. Yes, obviously. The hall came up like a wave, missus. Pursglove audibly abandoned 30 years of discretion, and Sir Aldous Fern, a magistrate to his boots, was heard to instruct the clerk, dryly, to enter the answer in the record. They were married in the spring from Felgate Hall, every shutter open, every chimney lit, the house, missus, Pursglove said, warm through for the first time in her 30 years, as if it had only ever been waiting for a reason. Half of Harrow Cross made the journey north, her uncle blinking, her aunt magnificent in new silk, and a state of profound arithmetical revision. To Mrs. Dunnage's credit, a small ledger, but let us enter what's in it. She got through the wedding breakfast, before attempting, of course. I always said Tamsin was the jewel of the family, and to the county's credit, nobody within earshot let her finish. The new Duchess of Renfield kept her own books, and the estates, and they balanced. The wedding gifts included, from the Duke of Ravensmore, a travelling chess set and a card reading only, "Madam, avenge us all." And on an evening in that first spring, Edmund found her at the south parlour table with the old marbled game book, entering the score of the evening's play. He read over her shoulder the line she had written at the bottom one, "Windy midnight in December, whatever this house is keeping quiet, it is not a simpleton," and beneath it, in fresh ink, her verdict on the whole affair, "And I will let it close the story, because I could not put it better and have the grace to know it. Final accounting. I was sent north because nobody would miss me. 90 games, 1 winter, and 1 truthful liar later. Missed, waited for, seen, and home. The book's balance. T. Renfield, who plays white next and means to win. She did win, the next game. He always swore he never let her. Nobody in Harrowmere has ever quite decided whether to believe him. And that is the story of the silent nephew, who was never simple, and the overlooked woman, who was never invisible. They only wanted somebody honest enough to look. Rest easy tonight. No one worth knowing is ever truly invisible, least of all you. Another tale is already waiting on the shelf.